Good evening, everyone. Welcome to, let's call it Chapter 2 of our discussions regarding the 2021 budget and its effects in relation to the Black community. We're happy to have you. As you see on our screen, we have our panels from the first discussion with a few additions and a very, very special guest, as you can see there with Minister Ahmed Hussein. I'm Michael Carter. I will be moderating this evening. And what I'm about to do is just ask everyone for a brief discussion, a brief intro of themselves, leaving the minister to last, and then we will get going. Again, thank you for tuning in. And I would just want to say this does not necessarily represent every single person or every single organization in the country, but a collection thereof. Okay. With that in mind, I would like to first introduce Richard Miller of Keepsakes. Richard, would you give an introduction and again why we are doing this along with you as a team? You're on mute, Richard.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you again. It's nice to see everyone. I'm Richard, the founder of Keepsakes nonprofit organization. We're a nonprofit organization that caters to the community and individuals that has been through the justice system, but also individuals in the marginalized community. Our focus is to uplift our community, but also to empower our youth with employment in the trade and the tech industry, and also in the construction industry.
Thank you, Richard. Craig Wellington.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Richard and Michael, for putting this together, and Minister Hussein, great to see you and everyone else. So I'm the executive director of the Black Opportunity Fund, which has a focus on developing a sustainable pool of funds in partnership with community, government, business, and philanthropy to develop to build capacity for Black community organization and Black communities across Canada. So pleased to be here and looking forward to this chat.
Thank you, Craig. Ms. Paulette Senior.
Good evening, everyone, and to my esteemed panelists, to you, Minister Hussein, always good to see you. My name is Paulette Senior, President and CEO of the Canadian Women's Foundation. I come to you this evening from Indigenous lands, of which I'm very grateful to be on, and that this conversation is taking place, of many Indigenous peoples from across the country, and also thankful to my own ancestors that we are here to have this conversation today. My organization focuses on, which is the Canadian Women's Foundation. We raise money and grant money to women's organizations across the country that focus on gender justice, intersected with racial and other kinds of justice, having to do with ensuring that we can build an equal society for all Canadians. We've raised millions upon millions of dollars and granted them, and we also work very hard towards bringing about systemic change on various advocacy issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Paulette. And our newest panelist, Christelle Francois. Welcome.
Welcome. Hi, everyone. Good evening. Hello to my fellow panelists, and thank you, Minister Hussein, for joining us this evening. I'm Christelle Francois, the president of the Canadian Black Chamber of Commerce. We're an organization really dedicated to being the ecosystem hub for Black businesses across the country. And we also do advocacy work in terms of engaging with various stakeholders to ensure that there's equity distribution and ensuring that Black entrepreneurs are also reflected in the budget. Donc, bonsoir à tous. Mon nom est Christelle François. Je suis la présidente de la Chambre de commerce des Noirs du Canada. Et nous sommes une organisation dédiée à supporter les entrepreneurs noirs du Canada, et ainsi aussi de s'assurer que nous faisons partie des conversations pour s'assurer que les entrepreneurs sont reflétés dans le budget au niveau fédéral, provincial et municipal. Merci.
Merci. Thank you so much. Emmanuel.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks, Richard, again for bringing us back. Ramadan Kareem, Minister, good to see you again, and to my fellow panelists. I'm looking forward to this conversation today. I hold the space for a team at NAPSI, the Network for the Advancement of Black Communities, which is a systems change, capacity building, research, knowledge mobilization entity that lives at the interface between governments, philanthropy, the Black community sector. the ultimate goal of NAPS is really to see in Canada a vibrant and strong Black community sector.
Thank you, Emmanuel. Daniela Johnson.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Daniela Johnson. First, I would just like to, take the opportunity to acknowledge and thank Keep Six and LEAP for bringing us together for these discussions. Thank you to the Honorable Minister Hussein for joining us, and of course, thank you to everyone for tuning in. So I'm happy to share that I'm currently seeking the federal Liberal nomination for Brampton Centre. And as I participate on this panel today and continue to move forward with my nomination, I bring with me a background of working with the community and working to serve the community, specifically working in partnership with the community to support immigrants and refugees, youth, and the social impact sector as a whole, in roles with the municipal government, the Ontario Trillium Foundation, and most recently with Lift Philanthropy Partners, where my focus was on supporting the capacity building of social purpose organizations to have a greater measurable impact, to grow into scale and to become investment ready. So thank you. I'm looking forward to today's discussion.
Thank you, Daniela. And Minister Hussein, we're so happy to have you. Thank you so much for joining us, and I will give you the floor.
Thank you very much for having me, and I appreciate the opportunity to have this important discussion. I won't dwell too much on my remarks. I'll just highlight a few pieces from the budget. The budget being what it is, it's a very comprehensive budget, the first budget in 2 years. So obviously, I wouldn't do it justice to try to even summarize it in the short period of time that we have. But what I will simply say is that it's really a budget to try to achieve two related goals. One is to support Canadians as we realize that the pandemic is still with us. So continuing the various supports for businesses, for workers, for nonprofits, for communities to get through the pandemic. So that's the first goal of this budget. And the second way you can look at this budget is also about putting the investments in place now that are necessary for a strong green but inclusive economic recovery. Things like going really big on early learning and childcare, putting together a Canada-wide system that will introduce truly what I believe to be a truly affordable, high-quality, accessible, and inclusive system. And then going big again on housing, affordable housing, and putting additional dollars there, and more supports for nonprofits and charities, significant supports for young people through skills training, doubling of the Canada Student Grant, creation of hundreds of thousands of jobs, expansion of the Canada the Canada Student Jobs Program, the Canada Summer Jobs Program, I should say, and job placements that lead to skills development and so on. And then there's supports for seniors and other pieces to get Canadians ready for the jobs of the future. Particular to Black Canadians, obviously everything that I've mentioned impacts Black Canadians as well, including the historic investments we're making in affordable housing. For example, the Rapid Housing Initiative. Before I was minister, it just used to say, minority groups or racialized Canadians, but I particularly insisted that they add as a distinct focus of our Rapid Housing Initiative, for example, it now says racialized Canadians, including Black Canadians, as an example. And actually, we have a matrix to make sure that the investments that we're putting in place with the proponents and the populations reflect Canada. That's why, for example, in the Emergency Community Support Fund, I can tell you what percentage of that money went to Black Canadian organizations and Black Canadian populations. That's the level of granular data that we have now, which I think is deliberate because that's something the community asked for. This budget, again, goes big. The good thing that came out of the Supporting Black Canadian Communities initiative is we found out the sheer demand for those dollars in terms of improving and contributed to an increase in capacity building and capital projects for Black Canadian organizations. The money that was dedicated to it was significant, but the demand was much higher, which was good to know because then I could go back to the government and say, we got to do better. And I'm thankful that the Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance have listened, because the Supporting Black Canadian Communities initiative is going from $25 million over 5 years to $100 million just this year. That's incredible. And it will allow the government, and specifically me as minister, to reach way more projects than we could have last time, because we received a lot of good projects that we couldn't get to because we ran out of money. The second one is something you're very familiar with, the call for an endowment fund. Again, we've listened and we're setting up a $200 million endowment fund, and the details on how it will be executed is something that we will be talking about with to the community, because we have to co-develop. We can't just go ahead and make those decisions in Ottawa out of respect for the community. So those are the two that I'll highlight. There's additional supports to really entrench and expand the collection of disaggregated data and analysis in Statistics Canada. $172 million going there, $87 million going to tackle systemic racism in the RCMP, $88 million, a portion of which will go to community organizations in racialized communities for enabling people to become rehabilitated after contact with the criminal justice system, including easier obtaining of pardons, and then a number of other investments that I won't go into, and I'll turn it over back to you.
Thank you, Minister. I will ask Emmanuel to start us off with the Q&A section. Emmanuel, I'll give you the floor.
Thanks, Mike. Minister, indeed, the announcements and the commitments are historic, as you have indicated, and I think there are a number of entry points in the federal budget that speak actually to investments and commitments for Black communities. We're really, as we have indicated in a number of occasions in the recent past, quite pleased about your government's commitment towards Black communities. As you have indicated in your introductory remarks, I think one of the goals of the budget is actually to move Canada to an inclusive, greener economy. And I think the dedicated investments that you have around Black communities that you have mentioned, the supportive Black Canadian community initiatives that NAPSI has been really involved in supporting, the increase in the investment there, the new endowment fund, these are all great investments. And I think would be good to hear from you what are some of the mechanisms that would be in place to really mobilize these resources into the hands of the community, given everything that's happening in government. So one important question, Minister, is what concrete mechanisms can we think of having at your end and your peers, obviously government, in collaboration with Black communities to really concretize the full participation of Black communities in the budget? For example, in the budget, there is more than $17 billion dedicated to greening Canada. Yeah? Mm-hmm. How can the Black community participate there? I think the $172 million, great commitment around disaggregated data. Yeah. Data is at the core of our challenges. Yeah.
Yes.
How do we ensure concretely some mechanisms that the Black community could work with Stat Canada, for example, mm-hmm. to make sure that the Black community fully participates? If you can speak about the full participation in the budget, would be great. Thank you.
So I actually think you've really hit the nail on the head, because, for example, there's 87, I should have mentioned this. This is a really important one. $87 million to set up a program in Public Services and Procurement Canada, again, to respond to something that came from the community, which is access to procurement and government contracts for racialized community entrepreneurs. So that obviously includes Black Canadians. That's an opportunity. That's an opportunity and a concrete response in the budget to the call by Black Canadian leaders for procurement access for Black Canadian entrepreneurs. So I feel like the more I read this budget, and it's a long budget, 729 pages, you see those opportunities. $51 million more in the Black Entrepreneurship Program, a program that was already looking at $221 million investment between the private sector and our government in the form of grants and loans. That program is now getting an additional $51 million through Budget 2021. And so on and so forth. So I think, Emmanuel, the short answer to your question would be, it will now, in a sense, it's now Of course, it's up to us to make those investments tangible and work with the community and deliver them in a way that they land really well and have the biggest impact. But on the other hand, on some of these pieces, we kind of need guidance. For example, the Endowment Fund. That's something that will have to come in the same way that even the idea of setting up an endowment fund for Black Canadian charities and nonprofits came from the community. In the same way that the idea came from the community, I think the implementation should also, to some extent, be co-developed by the community. And so I can't commit to all the other things because I have enough on my plate in terms of my portfolio. I can commit to the pieces that come under me. I will co-develop as to the extent that I can. I will co-develop. I'll try to use intermediaries in the Black Canadian community, really get that co-development piece. I would suggest and highly advise the community to do the same, for example, in the procurement program. I hope the Black Canadian community steps up and engages the Minister of Public Services and Procurement Canada, the Honorable Anita Anand, to say, hey, we notice you're going to get $87 million to set up a program to bring in racialized entrepreneurs to access government programs and contracts and procurement. We want to play a role. So this is the time to be proactive. In a sense, I mean, the pieces that are within my ministry, I'll reach out. I'll do the, I'll make that. I'll take those initial steps. But I would highly recommend to the leadership here to engage those other ministers. And I'll do my part. I'll sensitize them. I'll engage them, and I'll report back whatever we discuss here. But reach out to Minister Anand and say, hey, we see that you got $87 million for procurement for racialized entrepreneurs. We want to make sure that Black entrepreneurs are part of this. And how do we do that? And the beautiful thing about it is it's $87 million to set up the program. So you can influence the actual building and the architecture of what it would look like in a way that then you will be able to be in a position to make it work for Black Canadian entrepreneurs. So in other words, when you, and then this, I can say the exact same thing. There's $88 million going towards rehabilitation and access to pardons. Now, it says in the language of the budget that some of that money will go to community organizations in racialized communities to enable young people to get pardons. Now, I expect the leadership, again, of Black Canadian organizations to step up, to go to Public Safety Minister and say, Minister Blair, we see that you're spending 88 million here. Where's our allocation so that we can do the work? And we
So,
do
Minister,
the work in a way, yeah.
So Minister, great. I think you've been a good example in working with the Black community in the last 2 years plus around the supporting Black Canadian Community Initiative, for example. We've created Black Intermediaries. Yeah, we're adding a fourth one from Western Canada.
Yes, and I'm doing that work, yeah.
So on the investments around procurement, rehabilitation, and even housing, what is lacking, observing this very closely, is actually the intermediary structure, the structure of engagement,
right.
Which cannot happen simply because Black leaders are stepping up. They will always. I think there is an opportunity here to actually enable that capacity, that structure. And so are you prepared to actually work with us to actually take some of these examples so that in the other, I'm a former marine ecologist, not many people know about that about me, And so 17 billion plus in the budget is dedicated to the environment. We need to get Black Canada involved in greening Canada,
Sure.
What structures can we think of in terms of building capacity to create on housing, for example? We met with you and the president and CEO of CMHC. On the housing, we need a structure within the Black community to tap into this multi-billion-dollar investment. So are you prepared to work in enabling, creating that intermediary capacity to engage with the federal government?
Absolutely. So again, I can speak for the aspects of the budget that come under my ministry. That I have control over, and I can tell you there, whether it is increasing capacity, whether it is bringing in intermediaries, you have me there. I was doing that even before you asked. I did that with the Emergency Community Support Fund even before the community asked me to do that. In other words, the making sure that like the intermediaries had a plan in place to make sure that the funding was distributed in an equitable manner. That's why I can tell you the exact percentage of that money that went to Black Canadian community organizations. It's 5.6%. How do I know that? Because I demanded those numbers before any dollar went out the door, and I'm going to do that again with the new Community Services Recovery Fund. And in fact, I'll go one better, and I'll open up the intermediary model to Black Canadians. So if there's Black Canadian community intermediaries, they'll have an opportunity to apply. So we'll talk about that when we get there. On housing, I am thinking about, after the meeting we had last time, even prior to that, how can I support through the National Housing Strategy investments? And this is more of a long-term game. How do we improve the capacity, even build it? Because sometimes it may not exist, right? We may not have the like, for example, the United Church of Canada has a subsidiary organization called the United Church Property Corporation or something like that, housing corporation. They are building 5,000 affordable housing units across Canada, and they're partnering with the government of Canada to leverage the national housing strategy. To be honest, I don't think there is that level of capacity for a developer like that in the Black Canadian community, but we can get there, right? We can invest in that. So my plan now, and it's not fully cooked, but I'm working on something within the National Housing Strategy, especially through the Co-Investment Fund, to dedicate sums of money to develop capacity for building affordable housing within Black Canadians. I think that's, Emmanuel, what you're referring to. So I'm on it. I'm not there yet, but I'll report back to the community on that. When it comes to the endowment fund, again, I can speak to that because that's something that I fought for and I suspect will come under my ministry. So I commit to co-developing that execution with the Black Canadian community. And when I say Black Canadian, I mean across the country, not just in the GTA or in Ontario, Quebec. Like, we're talking about Western Canada and everywhere else. So we will have those discussions. When you're talking about the 17 billion for green and so on, and the $300 million for the Heritage Fund for artists and so on, I can do two things. One is highlight to those ministers that they should try to do the same thing that I'm doing to engage Black Canadians in the formulation of those funds. But I would also encourage you to do the same thing and engage with them and sit with them and say, look, we need you to include us in not just in the execution, but even in the design of the program. And I'm happy to help in that regard. It's just, there's just so much, right?
Thank you, Minister. Paulette Senior, I'll ask you to take the floor.
Thank you, Michael. And Minister, I'm just going to build a little bit from where you were with Emmanuel, but a bit more focused.
Yeah, sure.
So, the investments that were announced address specific issues within the Black community, whether it's
Right.
small businesses or, philanthropy and through the Endowment Fund or all the things that you mentioned. And these are long overdue investments
Yes.
that have finally begun to take shape. But that said, I think what's most critical now is the actual timing of when some of these funds are going to be released, especially those that are focused on recovery, if not emergency, but recovery. So can you speak to more specifically about how these discussions are going at Treasury Board in order to release these funds more sooner than later? And to also keep in mind that there could be an early fall election, and that could have some impact on whether or not these funds can be released or even have this kind of multi-year approach to it.
A very good question. Really, really relevant questions. From my end, here's what I will assure you. First of all, I don't know of any discussion in government towards an election. We're not really focused on that. There's so much to do with respect to COVID. There's so much to do with respect to the recovery. We are really focused. Everything that we introduce in the House is related to helping Canadians. When you look at the folks who are voting against the confidence motions and the budget bills, they're the ones who are looking for an election. And this is not political talk. It's actually what I see on the ground. I don't think about an election. I think about how to deliver these programs. What I'm trying to do, first of all, the obvious one is the budget bill has to get parliamentary approval, and we need the support of the opposition to do that because we don't have a majority in the House. But as soon as that happens, I have a plan in place to go to Treasury Board as quickly as possible at the first available window. And I have pre-positioned myself to do that. So in terms of this is the sequencing that I see. For the Supporting Black Canadian Communities Initiative, that's very easy. As soon as we get budget approval and Treasury Board authorization, we will go ahead. The only thing that will be new is the seeking of a fourth intermediary from Western Canada. But everything else is in place, so we can just execute. The one that will take a little longer is the Endowment Fund, because that needs design, it needs community consultation and expectation of what it will look like. And as you know, different people in the community have different ideas of who should manage it and how should it look like. On the third piece around, which I didn't mention, social enterprises, for example, the Social Finance Fund. I'm seriously considering opening up the expected intermediaries to make sure that we, again, have representation from different communities, including Black Canadians. The same goes for the Community Services Recovery Fund. That's another one that's coming. $400 million we expect to go right away. Again, there shouldn't be a lot of design issues there. But again, do we just go with the 3 previous intermediaries for the sake of speed, or do we take a little longer and open it up for Black Canadian and other intermediaries to come in? I'm leaning towards the second one, but I find that when you take a little bit longer to do the right thing, people sometimes complain and say, "Why are you taking longer?" So you can never win sometimes, right? But I'm really trying to open it up to be fair. We'll do that with all these other funding programs that we have. At least in my control, is opening up that space to build that capacity, as Emmanuel said. On housing, CMHC has enough money now in the budget, and even prior to the budget, for me to be able to experiment and start pilot programs to build that capacity slowly. Emmanuel, I don't want to set up very high expectations in the sense that the size of that money may not be what you may expect. I don't have an unlimited budget, but I can, in principle, I will look for as much money as possible to build that capacity for 2 groups of people, particularly Black and women, Black Canadians and women. Because for Indigenous, we have been investing in that capacity, and there is a co-developed housing distinction-based money that has been flowing to the 3 national Indigenous organizations, as well as building capacity through Reaching Home. But for Black Canadians and women, there is a push by government, particularly for women, and I want to include Black Canadians in that mix to develop that capacity. I don't know how much money I'll get, but even if I cannot get money from the government, I'll fund it through the existing allocations within CMHC. There's some flexibility that I have, so we'll do that. But you can help me by proactively seeking out that segment of the community that is interested in building that affordable housing, because not everyone wants to do this, right? So that's one way you can help me while I look for the money. Is that okay? Emmanuel.
It is, Minister, it is. And in fact, after the Housing Roundtable, and as you know, CMHC is about to embark, and we're working with them and Monumental to consult deeply with Black communities in 4 cities across Canada.
Yes.
I think like one of the things that NAPSI we will hear us advocating is creating a structure of engagement. Yeah. So one around housing could be perhaps creating a national Black communities housing council that would work very closely with you and CMHC to implement the budget. Yeah.
I see. Okay.
Did you have a follow-up, Paulette?
I was, but the minister mentioned it. But maybe I can just be a bit
more. Did I answer
specific.
your question, Paulette? Yeah. Go ahead.
You did, Minister, and you went even farther, and I appreciated that. But just a quick follow-up is so I know that the approach of intermediaries is one that has been effective and efficient in most circumstances. I know the Canadian Women's Foundation, we certainly worked with women and gender equality to get tens up and millions of dollars out to the sector. So we know how well it works. The capacity building piece for the Black community is important, as well as ensuring that there is a wide enough scope of intermediaries that will help the Black community to feel included as opposed to excluded.
I see.
Right? So that's an important piece to consider, and perhaps it's something that folks like us could help out with to make sure that we're not just going to the usual suspects that have already lined up, but that we're broadening that scope a little bit, and to ensure that there's capacity building that goes along.
So that's the challenge that I have. So for example, in the Emergency Community Support Fund last year, and you have to remember this was very early during the pandemic, the priority was to get that money out as quickly as possible. But at the same time, I wanted to make sure that it was distributed equitably. So if we went through the government process and we said to everybody, just apply to the government, it would have taken us three months to get the money out. Instead, we got the money out in 3 weeks. So that was the advantage of speed. But then what we did as a back end is negotiate with the 3 intermediaries to say, what is your plan to make sure that the money is distributed equitably? So we were able to achieve both. But what Paulette is talking about, that's something that I would need guidance from all of you, which is, do we go through the intermediaries and have them deliver the money quickly, but also build that capacity through them for Black Canadians? Or do we do both? Like, because again, it depends on what we're talking about. But for example, on housing, there are established players. And I know, for example, the United Church Property Corporation, they're very good at building affordable housing, and they have proactively reached out to other faith groups to say, let us show you how to use the National Housing Strategy to build affordable housing. Now, instead of reinventing the wheel, maybe they could be an ally to help kind of share the roadmap, and then we fund the capacity building. I don't know if that makes sense.
Maybe I can speak as an intermediary myself at the foundation. So yeah, I know that my organization would be willing to help in whatever way that looks like to build capacity, because this is the work that we do. It's our bread and butter. And so if there are organizations within the Black community who want to know how to do that transparently, effectively, efficiently, and what is the process that we use, we're happy to share that, because it is a model that works, and we have had 3 decades of doing this work, right? So we're happy to help out, but at the same, so the capacity building is important, but I also wanted to address the usual suspects within the Black community that we've been funding.
Oh, I see. Okay.
As well, right? So that piece, so both are important.
But let me ask you this. My opinion, and I could be wrong, but my sense is that Canadian Women's Foundation, for example, would be better suited to help build capacity for Black Canadian community organizations when it comes to the Community Services Recovery Fund, because that's more in line with what you do, versus if we're targeting building capacity for Black Canadians to build affordable housing, then another more affordable housing oriented group would be a better partner. So okay, so we're saying the same thing. Perfect. Okay.
And Minister, I think you're referring to the Emergency Community Support Fund. You put pressure from your end. That's why you know the 5.6%.
Yeah.
We put pressure from the Black community on the intermediaries that you selected. We met with the 3 CEOs of the Intermediaries, United Way of Canada, Red Cross, and Community Foundations of Canada, and we worked with them. And as I indicated in the past, for example, you cite Toronto United Way as an example.
Yes, yeah.
So we worked very closely with them.
Thank you.
Bottom up, we created clusters of grassroots, Black grassroots that were not able to access the COVID response fund. So we're collaborating in that endeavor. Yeah, I think what Paulette is offering here is that it's time for us to actually diversify our approach in terms of engaging the Black community. The other thing I would offer as an advice here is, when you work with mainstream intermediaries as opposed to with Black intermediaries, I think taking time to invest in building a capacity of intermediaries has medium to long-term impact in Black communities. So the hybrid model, for example, if you feel more comfortable to move readily with those intermediaries that your department has worked. Let's at least use a hybrid model.
Well,
that
that's what I was
allows
thinking. That's what I was thinking.
To,
so you
to
get
build
the
the
best of both.
capacity of the Black intermediaries. Otherwise, what's going to happen is money in and money out. Yeah, there is no retention capacity in the Black community per se. And then I think the last comment I would make here is we must attach accountability for results for Black communities to all this engagement with intermediaries. And I think like the emergency community, the community services recovery grant or fund that you have at the moment, if you use the same approach as you mentioned for the emergency community support grant, one of the things that we are not discussing is the pandemic and anti-Black racism has disproportionately impacted Black communities. So we need to go beyond the 5.6% when we think about protecting resources for Black communities. That's why I'm going to offer as an additional comment.
Okay, sounds good. Maybe we'll do one last round, and then I have to go.
Okay, perfect. Richard?
We only scheduled half an hour.
Okay, the minister doesn't have a lot of time, so I'll give you the floor.
Thank you very much. My pleasure. And thank you for joining us, Minister. I have one question to ask you, and it's outlining about what exactly is in process when it comes to the funding coming out to the community. At this present time, we're quite aware that a lot of the grassroots organizations are not being able to get these funds. These funds are going to the large organizations who've been getting it for many, many years. And these organizations.
Which funds are you referring to? Which funds are you referring to, sir?
Well, even if we're talking about even the funds when it comes to the youth and the programs in the community.
Okay.
Right. I myself at Keep Six, we've been here for many, many while working, and unfortunately, we haven't been able to get our hands on any of the funds for the programs that we are running. Even a program that we have out right now called Gangs for Tuition, which we're fortunate enough to have some support from the Brampton Mayor Patrick Brown and so forth. But with that said, I mean, what accountability will these individuals be held at when it comes to these funds? Because that's something that's been going on. We're not seeing the funds. We've been hearing about it. It's wonderful. But we down here in the community, in the trenches doing the work, we're not seeing it.
So you're absolutely right. The problem has always been, it's like a chicken and egg situation. Not all, but some organizations in the Black Canadian community don't have the capacity to navigate the structures to get to those funds. So that has always been a challenge. I know from my previous work as a community activist, that was always the challenge. People, they know these funds exist, government announces them, but they don't have the capacity to apply for them or to get them. And so community has been asking government for a long time to invest in capacity building of Black Canadian community organizations. And we listened by introducing the Supporting Black Canadian Communities initiative, which then showed that the need was even greater than we thought. And so we've come a long way. Now we have 100 million to do that and capital projects. The answer I have for you is that has been an ongoing problem. We're finally doing something about it. There are also initiatives like NABC and others are running to mentor like larger Black Canadian community organizations like Groupe Transset in Quebec, NABC and BBI, and hopefully another one in the West. They're actually coaching and mentoring smaller Black Canadian community organizations to navigate these systems so that they get these funds that they're eligible for and where the need is great. So my answer would be that the good news is that there's way more money now, either directly going to Black Canadian communities and earmarked for them, or some that are indirect, like the procurement programs and others, and some that have the potential. For example, the childcare money, the affordable housing money. It doesn't say Black Canadians, but you could easily leverage those. So the good news, Richard, is that there's even more money now than ever before that can be accessed by Black Canadian community organizations for Black Canadian community needs. The challenge always has been that capacity piece. So obviously, there's a lot that government can do to improve that capacity, but there's also a lot that we can do to invest in larger Black Canadian community organizations to then, through them, build that capacity, as we're doing with SBCCI. And again, I'm really happy that we're going from 25 million over 5 years to 100 million just this year. Imagine what we can do more with that. And I'm really, I mean, can you, so many good projects we had to turn away last time because of a lack of money. Now we can proceed with. So I would just say that it's a work in progress. I don't have, it's not like we can turn a switch and everything will be solved, but now we actually have the formula that works. And that's what we were talking about in terms of dedicated investments, dedicated policies, set up those structures so that even if there's another minister in my place, they will follow that structure so that it's not dependent on the government of the day.
Thank you, Minister. We'll have time for just 3 more questions. Craig Wellington.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the questions that have been asked certainly are part of where my thinking was, certainly around the intermediaries, that structure, and ensuring that we use the Black intermediaries and not just the mainstream, and that that there's metrics. And I think I had some more questions in terms of, for example, some of the programs like the Endowment Fund, which is a tremendous, and it's a historic start. And as you've outlined, there will be a detailed process in terms of engaging the community and so on, in involvement, as with many of the other initiatives that you've spoken of. Can you give a bit of color, if you could, in terms of what that engagement process, community engagement process, looks like,
Yes.
and the timing and the rollout and so on for that, if you might.
So
Thanks
that's exactly. So I'll use an example that has already occurred to show you what I'm thinking about. For the Supporting Black Canadian Communities initiative, we met with the community, we figured out the model that worked best, and then we incorporated that into the rollout. But again, I must note something, because we went through that process, which took time to do the right thing and to actually build that capacity. We did get some criticism from another segment of the Black Canadian community saying, why is this money taking so long to get out? And the thing is, I could have gotten out the money very quickly if we just did this, if we did it the same old way. But I didn't want to do things the same old way. I wanted to get 2 for the price of 1, invest, but also build capacity, both for the small organizations, but also the NAPCs of the world. So the same thing is happening with the Black Entrepreneurship Program under Minister Ng. The program was announced in August last year. The reason they're opening the applications now in May is because it took that long to kind of get all the eligibility pieces right, to make sure that there was representation. I met with a lot of Black Canadian entrepreneurs. One of the key messages I heard from them, especially the women, they said, you better make sure we're not left behind in that execution. And I said, okay. So I took that feedback to Minister Ng and said, we have to make sure that it's not disproportionately favoring Black male entrepreneurs. So that's the kind of feedback that you get. For the Endowment Fund, I think it's a lot of practical issues. Who's going to run it? Who's going to be on the board? What should it look like? How independent should it be? Where should it invest? Where should the proceeds go after? So it's a very complex conversation, but luckily we have examples to draw upon that we can look at and say, is this the way to go, or is this the way to go? So there's the Equality Fund, there's the Trudeau Foundation, there's a bunch of foundations we can look at and say, is this how we want to go? Or we may try something completely new, but that's not my decision to make without at least talking to the community, right?
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister.
Christelle?
Yes, my question is really specific to when it comes to Black entrepreneurs. So you briefly touched on that in terms of, in addition to the 221, we know that there's a 51.7 that's being allocated. Yes.
Right.
So my question is really around what can we expect in terms of what that execution actually looks like for this additional fund? Will it be in a similar process in terms of what is happening now in May, which is through the banks and through the other, FACE coalition organization, or will it have a different framework in terms of, additional grants? What can people and Black entrepreneurs expect in terms of what that looks like?
So I'm going to actually surprise you pleasantly and tell you what would you like it to look like, and then I'll make sure it happens.
Okay, great.
That's the better way to go, right? Because this is our money. It's 51 million from the government of Canada. We can decide to put it all in loans. We can decide to put it all in grants. We can decide to put it in the knowledge hub. We can decide to go through the financial institutions. What would work better for you?
Absolutely. I can definitely answer that. I think what would work best would definitely be in the form of grants. And I say that because the impact of COVID on entrepreneurs has been so detrimental, and having entrepreneurs take on additional debt is not necessarily in their best favors when they're just really trying to survive and hang. So I would advocate for it to be in the form of grants, and I would ensure that it would be through the different organizations that are already on the ground working with entrepreneurs across the country, to ensure that those funds are allocated in that capacity, but also support in terms of seeing how those funds are utilized to really measure impact, to really evaluate how that's been implemented. So that's what I would love to.
No, and that's a very good argument, and I will certainly take it up with Minister Ng, who has actually sought my opinion on this, and I will make sure that we may not be able to do all 51 million in grants, but at least as high a percentage as possible, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Because some of it should go to the Knowledge Hub. One question I have for the audience, especially for Paulette and Emmanuel, because this is the stuff that I struggle with. In some cases, Black Canadian intermediaries are up and ready, and you just have to give them the money and give them the terms and go ahead. In other cases, it's very easy to develop that capacity. So I'm not worried about that. There is a third case, though, where, like, again, for argument's sake, say I have a program, I have 10 million or $100 million. There's very little capacity in the Black Canadian community. There's a lot of capacity in other mainstream organizations. In that case, and then there's a lot of pressure for me to get that money out. Wouldn't the next best thing be to strike a deal with some of those intermediaries to then put as a condition to accessing the funding for them to also help us as a government to grow that capacity while we execute the dollars? Would that be something that would work in some exceptional cases?
Paulette?
Yeah, maybe I can jump in. Emmanuel and I have sat at the same table with one of the intermediaries. And so we can always share stories about how we were pushing from the bottom while you were pushing from the top, right? And I think these organizations are well-meaning. So that's not the issue.
Right.
But I can tell you that when I think of the work we do at the Canadian Women's Foundation, the intersectional lens is ingrained in how we do funding.
Okay.
And so we can tell you, for example, that 25% of our funding goes to Indigenous women's organizations.
That's
right?
amazing.
So we can tell you that because that's always been a goal. And so I think part of the issue with, let's say, long-standing foundations that have long history in Canada is that, and who only have a requirement to distribute, let's say, 5% of their endowment.
Right.
5% of their endowment. That's all they do. And they may be doing other things, which is great, but it has not solved the problem of poverty, racism, all of these issues, right? So I think that when we look at these funds, it's not about them building capacity for how they've been doing it.
Okay.
Perhaps part of the capacity building is us telling them how they should be doing it.
Right.
Right? So turn that around a little bit.
That's a good way of doing it, yeah.
And no, and you're absolutely right. You know, Paulette, I think I have worked for one, you know, as a former funder myself. And I think what and when you have announced, for example, the Emergency Community Support Fund, we worked very closely with them. We created, for example, a reference group with the Red Cross.
Yeah.
We worked very closely with Community Foundation of Canada, United Ways, Canada, meeting with them soon again. I think the key thing, Minister, is how do we take the opportunity of, this new reality that you have created for Black communities. For the first time, we have in Canada a Black intermediary layer. There's a fourth one joining from West Canada. How do we actually
to be the minister who
totally
did that. That's incredible.
So let's build on that. I think the NAPSI is working with your department, for example, to ensure that the metrics and the evaluation and the sustainability and the capacity building are there in the right place. We work very closely with your department and the current intermediaries. I think we should take a calculated risk by building standards and expectations for results. And some of the concerns that my brother Richard shared, the majority of players in the Black community are grassroots. We have to create structures and mechanisms to flow the money down to the street level, so to speak, for Black communities. Yeah. Okay. So we can do it. I think we know the pressure that you have around urgency. And
but can you do it across the board, though? Do we have the capacity in the community? And I'm speaking I'm not speaking as a minister now. I'm speaking as a community member. Do we, as Black Canadians, have the capacity to do that across all these ministries, like for procurement?
That's why I was asking earlier on around building capacity, for example, around housing. If we, after this consultation,
that's fine. For my portfolio, I'm fine. I'll do it. But do we have the capacity even to advocate for the other ministries, procurement? Like the Heritage Ministry is setting up a $300 million fund for artists, for art, heritage, and culture. Well, we just need
to map out what exists in terms of assets, and there is a lot of capacity. We have Black artists that are working. We have folks. There might not be many, but we have Black developers, as you know. Yeah, right, and I think around health, the interest that Daniela has around mental health. Your government has invested in Black mental health, so there are new stories emerging. What I'm encouraging us to do is let's continue to invest on them so that we create a permanent reality for Black communities.
That's great. No, you've given me a lot of ammunition to use. From my portfolio, I'm fully committed to this model, Emmanuel, as you know, and Paulette, I hope you know that. I'm fully committed to this, and please continue to guide me so that I get it right, because it's not an easy thing to do, especially when you jump from one program to another, even within my ministry. And when it comes to housing, it's a completely huge beast, but I'm working on it, and we're going to get there. So that's why, for example, if it's a new program, it's easier to do. So, for example, in the Rapid Housing Initiative, we were able to get to a lot of Black Canadian proponents across the country. So I'm very proud of that. But when it comes to the other ministers, I need your help to also sort of advocate on your end. I'm going to raise that with them. I sit on cabinet committees, the cabinet committee for health and social affairs, the cabinet committee for the environment and the economy, the cabinet committee for global affairs, and then the agenda and results committee, which is an important one. So I'll raise this mechanism because I think it's a brilliant way to kind of really change the whole landscape, not just do a few things here and there, because by the time by the time we're no longer there, we will leave that legacy, those structures, as you say, Emmanuel. So I'm fully on board, but I'm asking you guys to also push my colleagues.
Before I go to you, Daniela, for mental health, just to piggyback on what's being said here, one of the things that might be a danger if we don't pay attention to it is that there are small grassroots organizations that can become, let's call it, intermediaries at a medium level. Those are organizations who are already doing the work. They have the trust of the community. They have the trust of those businesses. And in many different ways, they're just cobbling dollars and cents just to give to that organization, give to this organization to keep them afloat. But when it comes to the larger scale, they're not looked on. Companies like OFC in Montreal, for instance, and there's many here in Toronto. So they're not large. But I think if they're given the small investment and the opportunity, what will happen is that we start today. 4 years from now, you have a fully fledged organization that's doing more work than they were doing before. And I think we have to start
I agree.
to listening to them. With that in mind, Daniela, I'll go to you next.
Great, thanks.
And then I have to go after that.
Okay.
I apologize.
No worries.
I'm going over my time. I'm getting heat from my staff.
I think we're having too much fun.
No problem. It's good.
Yeah, great. So the commitments made towards supporting mental health and well-being for all Canadians is certainly needed. But we're in a crisis that's only getting worse, especially when it comes to our Black community. So my question for you, Minister Hussain, is how are we going to ensure that funds for mental health are delivered with an extreme sense of urgency? And what are the plans for ensuring that the right organizations and the right projects get funded so that we're able to effectively reach the Black community and those individuals and families who've been disproportionately affected by COVID-19?
Fantastic question. There's two things I'll point to. Number one, there is a significant amount of money for general mental health, and then there is also dedicated money in this budget to tackle mental health approaches and frame them and customize them for particular communities, and it specifically points to Black Canadians. So that's the first answer to my question. The second answer of how are we going to make sure, I think it's a team effort. Government has to be sensitive to that, and I will raise that obviously, but the community folks who are interested in this have to get us there as well. They have to engage the Minister of Health, they have to engage the Public Health Agency of Canada to keep an eye to make sure that this funding, this significant funding by the way, lands in the right way for Black Canadians.
Thank you.
There's a question in the chat that says, how do you determine the criteria for selecting intermediaries? Normally in the regular criteria is, do they have the capacity to do this? But I think for Black Canadian organizations, it's a mixture. Some can do it. Others, like Emmanuel said, we have to invest, we have to build that capacity. And in housing, I commit that I will do that in housing and all the programs that I'm responsible for.
If there's any questions that people want to put, the minister only has a couple more minutes to spend with us. So I'm just looking to see if there are questions from the general public.
Maybe one last one and then
okay, a last one. If I don't see one, then anyone here on the panel can jump in with a final question for the minister before he goes. And Paulette, you've raised your hand first. Go ahead.
It's not so much a question, but I'm thinking about the diversity of the Black community. And
yes.
one aspect of the Black community that's always left out is our LGBTQIA plus brothers and sisters and gender diverse people. And so we have had a really bad history of excluding our LGBTQ folks, right? So I think it's important to also put that lens on it. There are a lot of young people in our community who have not come out to their families, who are suffering and living in deafening silence around that, right? And so I think we need to be careful because issues of mental health come into play, poverty come into play on top of that racism. So we have to think of the full health of all aspects of our community.
Excellent, very good reminder, and that's a very good reminder to keep an eye on that. When we were unveiling the Rapid Housing Initiative, we mentioned that it was one of the key pieces that was mentioned and focused on. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, I have to run, but this has been very, very informative and beneficial in terms of having this exchange. And these issues are not an event, they are a journey. We always have to keep an eye on them and always tweak and adjust and deliver and then keep going. So we've come far, but we haven't come this far to stop here, right? So we got to keep going and make even more progress for our community. And people are relying on us to deliver in a big way. And I'm sure with your guidance and constant engagement and advice and wisdom, we'll get there. Inshallah.
Thank you, Minister. We appreciate it very much. Thank you
so much. Thank you.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
So, that was a spirited, 1 hour discussion, initially slated for half an hour, then 40. And so obviously we ran with that. I'd love to get each person's viewpoint on what we heard from the minister. So far, one of my takeaways, which I'll just put on the table, and that is further engagement of each minister who has that portal of funds to give out. That we have to maybe, as a community, find ways to engage them in dialogues like this, but not just Q&A, but also directionally to say, here's what we think you ought to be doing, and this is how it probably can work, but we want to be involved as a community in ensuring that we get a carve out of what it is that you're doing, whether it's infrastructure, green, or whatever. But I'll just ask everybody, I'll just pick you individually to give me your take, your thoughts so far on the discussion and what the minister had to say. And Craig, since you're at the bottom of my screen, I will start with you.
Yes, no, thank you. And I'm much thanks to the minister for stepping into the firing line and answering questions honestly and openly and coming prepared for the core questions that we have. And as you said, Michael, that is definitely a key takeaway for me is there is a significant amount of money, not just the ones that is focused on Black community that has the word Black and the label on it, but across multiple tranches of government in other ministries. And we need to start looking at those and how do we make that money Black? How do we access that money? And it is engaged in those ministries. The procurement is a specific one about how do we look at ensuring there's, expanding the program specifically about procurement of Black businesses that Minister Anand has committed to, and ensuring that we put a greater Black lens on that and making sure that that program is built up with some capacity. Housing is definitely one that we need to look at, and from a number of levels. And I mean, we have to have that intersectional lens for our communities and understand that the Black community is Black communities, that there are multiple lenses, and we forget that. And even within our community, it is something that we miss, and we have to keep that laser right, and making sure that we look at all of these: mental health, the investment in youth, in childcare. How do we ensure that we are at the table and ensuring there's a Black lens? And that kind of jumps back to the piece about the intermediaries, because it is critical to have these intermediaries in place, but to have the Black lens of the intermediaries as opposed to the mainstream. And we do keep hearing, coming back to this question about capacity in the Black community, it needs to be something that there is a commitment when we're using the intermediary structure to build capacity in Black communities and Black intermediaries. So if there is an issue today with a lack of sufficient structure for Black intermediaries in specific areas, that 5 years from now we don't have the same problem, or 3 years from now we don't have the same problem. So the way to deal with that is to invest in it. It's almost the same kind of thing that you see in countries in the so-called developing world, where national organizations come in, different groups come in, and they're building for the country. And then down the road, you say, well, how come these construction projects aren't employing individuals from the country? How come the hotels being built in Jamaica, or the construction projects don't have engineers who were Jamaican? And what we hear is there wasn't capacity. So why aren't we building in as an outcome for when we bring in these intermediaries, that year 2 there must be a certain standard of capacity building in Black communities. Year 3 and year 5 there's a phase out, and we can transfer to Black communities. So we have a lens, and it is a different lens. Doesn't care how much as a mainstream organization you've worked with Black communities, you don't have the lived experience lens. It is not the same thing. And it is important that we that we emphasize that, and we make this something that is a criteria, right? A non-negotiable criteria.
Can you imagine? Thank you, Craig. Can you imagine if we had began this capacity building of Black intermediaries 5 years ago, 6 years ago, what it would look like today? That's just my thought. Richard?
Oh, thanks. So my main concern is, from the conversation, comes down to, again, the fund itself, the vetting process, the institutions that are doing the work be able to get these funds. For the last couple of years, I've been hearing about all these funds coming down, and I know it's a large sum of money, but again, is it going to be reaching individuals in the community? That's one of the main concerns that I find and other community members, the work that they're doing, but still we are hearing about these funds, but the funds are not reaching the capacity of the individuals who are actually doing the work to continue to even do more work that's needed in the community.
Thanks, Richard. Maybe somebody has an answer, or how do we change that? But with that in mind, Francois, Chrystal, I'll go with you, and then Paulette, I'm coming to you.
Perfect. I mean, I think in terms of our conversation with the minister, I think one of the things that's very evident is the government's commitment to supporting the Black community. And although, we can, I think numbers could be different and things like that, I think it's a great start in terms of just where we are in that type of commitment. One of the takeaways for me was that I think in terms of engaging the various ministers in terms of those different sectors, I think it creates that opportunity, I think, for us as a community to explore in terms of having those different organizations as well that tackle and focus on some of those different issues as well, to ensure that we're really covering and having that holistic approach, and that we're covering all of our bases as a community. Because whether we like it or not, we know that there are nuances in the Black community, but at the government level, oftentimes we're viewed as one entity, right? And I think amongst ourselves, it's just ensuring that we have those organizations that speak to those different causes. That way we can advocate with those various ministers and hold them accountable to ensure that there's that fair representation across the board in terms of the budget and in terms of policies that are implemented. But I think it's a great start for us to kind of move forward. And I really look forward to really seeing how things will continue to be implemented and, more importantly, measured, so our government is held accountable and we can really explore this for the next budget.
Thank you, Chrystal. Paulette, your take on the conversation.
I could not add any more to what Chrystal said that Craig started as well. So I'm going to acquiesce to Emmanuel to answer the question that was in the chat about the definition of capacity, because I see Craig also wants to address that.
Yeah, I think so. Emmanuel, please.
Thanks, Paulette. I think before I address the issue of capacity building, what's critically important for us to really have a cross-government strategy of engaging the federal government or any other levels of government for the interests of the Black communities. I think part of it, which is related to the capacity question, I think we should not forget that Minister Hussein, holds a significant portfolio. The portfolio that he's responsible for in his department deals with housing, childcare, early learning, social enterprise, social finance. It's a massive file. That's why I think we need to continue to engage with the level of support and accountability around the Black community engagement with Minister. I have known him from his days back in the community. He has been an ally not only now, but also in the immigration file. I've worked with Black community leaders to address some of the immigration and refugee issues in the continent. For years, he has been there at the forefront. He's an ally. But let's not let down or lower our guards around the public policy advocacy that we need to have, because it's a significant responsibility that he holds, and we need to support him, but at the same time, we need to see results. I think part of this is really the capacity question is, and I think there are valid concerns in the community that there are the usual suspects that are there out engaging on behalf of the Black community. Part of the capacity building here is actually building within the Black community the capacity for transparency, the transparency for accountability for results. We need some minimum standards around change for Black communities. When we talk about all these millions of budgets in this line, that line, that line, we have been there. Some of us have been there. We've been around long enough to know that we must deliver results for Black communities. So standards matter, data matters. And I think in terms of building capacity, we're openly advocating with no sense of shame here that it's time for us to actually build system capacity in the Black community. We need to build what's called system leadership, not just individual organizational leadership, system leadership, the leadership of grassroots. We need the grassroots at the policy table, not just the mainstream Black organizations and leaders, including myself. We need to be able to see, private sector leaders, phase leaders as I've said in the past, like the challenge that we face are systemic and generational and require collaborative solutions. We need to build a collaborative system capacity. So, Minerva, I think your question about, are we on the same page in understanding capacity? My experience, we are not. Are we making progress in terms of really moving in the direction where we need to be? I think so, with the creation of the Black intermediary layer, it's all about capacity building. If you go and look at what they have funded in the first cycle and they are preparing for the second cycle in the fall, it's building organizational capacity, in Black communities. Yeah, we're talking and supporting the intermediaries. What about adaptive capacity? What about capacity that we need to build in terms of recovery for Black communities? And that's why I think when you start looking at capacity building, there are the types of investment directly on Black communities, but the capacity to make progress on the housing file, on the mental health file, on the employment file, to mobilize those multi-million-dollar commitments, we need investment in Black community leaders and organizations, including grassroots, to sit. When the minister talks about co-design, co-develop, we need to have the grassroots to be enabled, some of them paid, for God's sake, to sit at the table to influence this process. So capacity building has different facets, but I encourage us to continue looking at standards, at data, at transparency, at accountability in this discussion.
Thanks, Emmanuel. Craig, I know you wanted to pick up a couple of things there on the so if you wouldn't mind, pick that up, and then I'm going to go to Paulette.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think capacity means many things. And Minister Hussein, when he was on the call, talked about it. One of the reasons that the usual suspects keep getting picked is because what they have is ability and understanding of the language of politics, and that is a huge part of it, right? It is positioning, it is politicking, it is so on. It is the accountability framework that Emmanuel has just referenced as well. Because for some organizations, if you focus on the medium and the big things and don't focus on the small things can trip you up. So for many organizations in the community, if they don't understand the structure, the worst thing that can happen to many organizations is that you get money. It's actually potentially challenging. So what we do need, as Emmanuel says, is how do we develop standards and how do we develop systems and wraparound services to build capacity. And it's something that our organization, Black Opportunity Fund, is looking at as we are looking to roll out granting and lending and so on, that we're also going to roll out wraparound services so the organizations that do apply for grants can be successful, can understand the language, can understand the structures that need to be put in place to be able to not get one-time grants, but multi-time grants, and to build and to be sustainable. One of the things, the language, I heard again the word collaboration, which we talked about a lot in our last discussion. It is something that as our organizations, we need to start working together more, especially smaller organizations that don't have the capacity to build it together, right? To look at strategic alignments. Where are the other organizations of similar size who have a similar vision, a similar mandate, but are missing pieces that you have? And it may, it may be that they're missing grant writing, which is something that many of our organizations lack. It could be the financial structure, it could be the program development, it could be events, it could be research capacity, and come together and collaborate. And then that's what, and apply together for grants. I just there's a quick discussion around the mental health funding when that was being rolled out. I was at an event led by Kamal Kara in Brampton, where all of these Black community organizations were around, and asked about how do we access this funding for Black community organizations. And I tell you, I was in the room for half an hour, and 4 different Black community organizations approached me asking me if I would be part of that And all 4 of the organizations had the exact same mandate, served the exact same community, and all 4 had CEOs. And I'm like, how do we look at bringing more of these organizations together, to work together, to build that kind of capacity and critical mass together? And I think it is something that we can try to look at as well. But capacity means a lot of things, and I think we have to be committed to building everybody up in the community in a strategic way, and then we have to have consistent standards. So we're not asking for Black community organizations to have higher standards than anybody else. We just want them to have the same kind of standards that all other groups are being measured against, not more, because that's not, that we're talking fair and equitable, but we need to talk about that and how we can do that collaboratively.
Thanks, Greg. Paulette, and one of the things that I really enjoyed, Paulette, was your outlining that your organization, and probably there are many other organizations, stand ready to shepherd other smaller organizations in walking them through and building them. I mean, in business, there's the shepherding of brands and organizations where you have a larger brand who has been there before, stand in surety of a smaller brand. Okay, by saying, look, come and work with us. What do you want? We will ensure that you have some success, but we will also stand here to train and to work with you, not just to train and work with you for a year or two before you get anything. Let's get you the things you need now, but work with you slowly so you can become better and more independent as we go along. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about that and the fact that the intermediary process, Paulette. You're on mute, by the way.
Thank you. I thought it would probably be helpful to give a little bit of insight into what that looks like in action. What does the work of the intermediary looks like? And so, as an organization that raises money from the public, from corporations, individuals, we've raised over $130 million over the past 30 years to grant out. And we have funded over 2,000, probably bordering on 3,000 organizations now. And we're in our 30th year, right? So we've done this. And so we've been able to amass and build a level of credibility and scrutiny and transparency and trust, right? So for us, that is what is invaluable, right? And so to be an intermediary means that it's about engendering trust, and you don't do that just by saying, trust me, right? You do that by actually abiding by principles and practices of transparency and accountability, and be willing to be challenged. And in our community, there's no shortage of challenge, right? But be willing to be challenged when an organization says, could you tell me why I wasn't funded, right? And not have this kind of shoulder up, whatever. Be able to open up and say, this is what came forward to us, right? And this is what we funded. We had $10 million. Our request was 20 million. We prioritized based on this criteria. Open that up and share that with the community. Because if you don't, then people are going to think that, that people are supporting their friends and it's who you know, that kind of stuff, right? And that stuff will be like wildfire in our community. So that approach is important. And in order to maintain that, we actually get outside people. So there are no grants that we've given out that as a CEO, I sit at the table deciding that. I do not. I'm not a part of that. In fact, we have committees where we pull from people from across the sector with different expertise that will come together. They will read the calls that come in, the proposals that come in, and they are basing it based on the criteria and priorities that we've preset. And based on that, they will grade the applications in terms of which ones will go forward for funding, right? So that is a process that we use to make sure that that it is transparent and it is not me deciding, or people can't call me and say, I want this funded, because I can't answer you, right? Because it's the committee that's dealing with it. And then the committee will make a recommendation to the board for a decision, right? But it is a list of organizations with the amounts that they've required and asked for that goes forward to the board for decision making, right? So it is transparent, it is clear, it's outlined, and that's important. And then one of the other things that we've done, we've pulled together other funders in the space, other women's organizations that fund, like the Equality Fund and CFC and others, to say, look, what are the principles that we'll abide by in grant making? So I'm just gonna take a moment to share that with you. So we are feminist organizations. So I'm really clear about that, unapologetic about that, right? So one of them is believe that we have to undo patriarchal relationships and social structures, and that these power over relationships and structures have harmed everyone, especially women, girls, trans, and non-binary people. So that's one of them, right? Another one is that we believe in pursuing truth and reconciliation and decolonizing practices. That's another. That we want to reflect on our power imbalances in their own, and power imbalances in our own lives, right? So we must understand power relationships. As the ones with the money, we have the power. So how do we level the playing field, acknowledge that power, and ensure that we're not developing relationships with those who are asking for money to make them feel powerless, right? So these are just some of the things that's important to put in place, and that we're always innovating, always innovating. How can we do better? Do some surveys, find out, like we found out that we were dismal in terms of providing grants to Northern Canada, right? And then we found out the problem was us. So if the problem is us, how do we get out of the way and actually fund what's important? And that's what we've done when we created the Northern Strategy. So those are just some of the things that, to us as a foundation, that where our credibility means everything, that we have to operate above board and transparently and ensure that our reputation always remain intact.
Thanks, Paulette. That was brilliant. Well said and well needed. Somebody had asked in the chat, and I apologize because I'm not seeing it at the moment, whether or not there really is a need for more intermediaries at the grassroots level. Is there a need to have more of that now, not later?
I mean, if we can jump, Michael, I think and fantastic, Paulette, I think one of the things that came to mind as I was listening to Paulette is how do we actually migrate or move or learn from these principles that Paulette shared into our practices in the Black community. Yeah? We have the Black Intermediary, the minister made reference to the Supporting Black Canadian Community Initiatives, which was part of the first announcement of the $25 million. There are three, and there is a fourth one that's in the process of being added from Western Canada. Yeah? So there is a something in the pipeline at the moment that we need to really, as I hear you, Paulette, I think we need to bring some of these principles to strengthen that layer. Yeah. And then I think we need to really understand at the granular level what the issues and challenges of our grassroots are. I think when the minister spoke about the Emergency Community Support Fund, the usual suspect that we're able to access is that there were established organizations. The grassroots were not able to access. Something needed to happen at the grassroots level to facilitate that. And that's why we work with a lot of organizations in the Black community. We created clusters, for example. At the moment, we have about 4 different clusters of organizations that came together, grassroots, to access the funds that ordinarily on their own they wouldn't, because simple eligibility criteria like having audited financial statements, did you have your last annual general meeting, your board of directors issues, and many other organizational requirements that are stringent, that kind of remove most of these grassroots as eligibility to access the dollar. So part of this is like, we need to go and learn where it's working. I think in the city of Toronto, for example, there has been a City of Toronto funded initiative called the Black to the Future Community of Practice that's run, by the C Center for Black Young Professionals. Yeah, they have been supporting a lot of grassroots through some of the grant writing, and they are running learning labs, and in some of these things we have collaborated to support them. So let's take advantage of what Paulette is offering. Yeah, let's look at what's working on the ground, and part of this is, we need to map out the existing assets, like the question that my brother Louis Marsh asked about. How do we ensure that the funds make it to the grassroots, and how do we ensure quality versus quantity? He made reference to the example in Jane and Finch, how many grassroots exist. We need to create structures for grassroots to be able to access the funding. And they cannot access the funding if they are invisible in the policy table discussions. That's why I was saying to the minister earlier on, you need to be able to actually enable this. We need to take these grassroots leaders with us when we have discussions around important investments that the federal government is doing. And I think NAPSI is going to launch some initiatives this year, but more than that, I don't want to take time to talk a lot about NAPSI. From a Black ecosystem approach, we need to work together to create these structures simple and accessible and transparent for grassroots. Anecdotally, we need to do the research, but anecdotally, I feel like more than 70–80% of the actors in the Black community are actually grassroots. So we need to refocus our energy and create new structures of access to the dollars and accountability and results for the grassroots. And there are some good examples out there that we can tap into.
You mentioned the invisibility of grassroots organizations. You take grassroots organizations like Keep Six, Richard's organization, right? There are many of them that are indeed invisible because they're not brought in to have conversations with leaders or politicians to allow others to know that this is who we are, this is what we're doing. How do you help us? And I think we might need to really and honestly bring them into the fold, or bring many of them to have those types of conversations with the Paulettes, with the Christelle, with you, Emmanuel, and just really be able to push these organizations up a little bit more and give them a little bit more heft. I see we only have 2 minutes, to be honest, and I'll give 30 seconds to you, Daniel, only because we had missed you and we were talking about what was your takeaway from the conversation with the minister. So unfortunately, I can only give you 30 seconds, and then I'm just going to ask everybody for their last thought. Yeah? Okay, go ahead, please.
Great. Thanks, Michael, and apologies for the connection. It just speaks to how important our infrastructure investments are. But my key takeaway is really around we needing to be bold and really be proactive and get involved and make sure that we have that seat at the table to be able to have the discussions and really engage with government and work in collaboration. So making sure that we're bringing the right people to the decision-making tables. We spoke about that in part one of this discussion, and I'll continue to say it because it's that important. How do we partner early and work with each other to do things differently to make sure that we're heard and we're seen and that we're able to, have the impact that we know that we can have. So I'll leave it there since I only have a few seconds, and I don't want to repeat what my fellow panelists have already spoken about.
Well, thank everybody. I thank everybody for showing up and for putting such amazing advice on the table. I hope everybody watching enjoyed it and learned something. And I'm going to try my very best to give final words, and just a final word or two. So, Richard, I'll start with you in the middle, and then we'll see how far we get before we get locked off. Final words, sir? You're on mute. That counts.
I just want to say thank you to everyone. I'm hoping that we're able to collaborate and work together. I think for us to reach stage and get over a lot of boundary, we all need to come together as a collective to move forward and to make the changes and, to do the work that we need to be doing. And Paulette and Emmanuel brought that up earlier. And I think, Paulette, yourself, you have a lot that maybe a lot of grassroots need to gather and come together as one, where we're able to work together to do the work that we need to get done.
Okay, Christelle?
For me, I echo those sentiments in terms of ensuring that we're working collaboratively, as a community, across the country to ensure that our community is fully supported. And I think more importantly, those of us who do have a seat at the table, who are part of pre-budget consultation meetings, to ensure that we can bring along some of these smaller grassroots organizations as well. I think oftentimes we are seeing some of the same faces at those tables. So it's also up to us to ensure that we are bringing them along and making sure that everyone has their voice heard at the table, so that there is equity in terms of distribution of funds to our community. But I think we're on a great start.
Thank you, Crystal. Paulette?
I just want to thank folks for showing up and the brilliant questions. We didn't get to all of them, but the questions were amazing, and I look forward to, I don't want to commit myself.
Don't tease it. Don't tease it.
To say, let's do part 3 of this, because it's really good community engagement that's going to help us move forward. But bring those questions, and maybe we can reserve more time for less talk from us and more for questions from folks who gave their time to be here tonight.
Thank you, Paulette. Emmanuel?
Thanks a lot. I really enjoyed round 2. I think the Black excellence for me is a byproduct of community accountability, community engagement. Some of the things that were shared this evening: transparency, accountability, trust. And I think we owe to the coming generations for us to really strengthen that Black family in order to deliver excellence. And I look forward to continue, building that Black ecosystem that we really wanted to see in place. Thanks also for inviting me again today.
Pleasure. Craig?
Thank you also for inviting, and it's been a pleasure, and love the great questions. I echo the talk about the Black ecosystem and the need to collaborate. And I want to go back to what Paulette talked about, the values, system, and principles as a granting organization. I would love us to expand that, to talk about what are our values and principles as Black community organization. What are the values and principle statements that we want everybody to say, this is how we work together, this is how we communicate to each other, and this is how we build trust and how we grow together. So I'd love to see that kind of thinking where we talk about that in terms of values and principles.
Can you imagine if all the organizations shared pretty well the same principles, just how transparent and easy a flow that would be for everybody across the board? Just a thought. I'm not sure how much time we have, and I was hoping that I would see a question that came across the screen that we could answer before we go. So if there is one, but prior to that, I would just like to thank Craig, Christelle, Danielle, Paulette, Emmanuel, and I really have to say my partner in this crime, Richard, for really just what we're doing here. You guys have been unbelievable, and we cannot just thank all of us, but we have to give a massive shout out to Minister Hussein for showing up the way he did and being so open to take it on. This has been brilliant. And I thank you, audience, for also participating. I think this has been lovely and brilliant. And as Paulette indicated, we may have to, look at a part 3 because there really is. I mean, this is a journey. We're not saying that the answers we provide are the end. What we're actually saying, we're trying to provide as much information for the community, and then to take that information, leverage it, and see what we need to do as we go along further and further. Okay, so that's what I think. I'm not sure how much time we have. Craig, go ahead, Craig.
Really, really quickly, as you say, I want to acknowledge Minister Hussein and really want to acknowledge him. We have one Black federal minister. And he has taken us to this point. Imagine if we have 5, if we have 6. Glad to see Daniela out there running. We need to build capacity inside, not just the outside, but for us to grow. Let us give him some support around. Many of us know what it's like being the only Black person in leadership position in white spaces. Imagine Minister Hussein fighting to push a Black agenda within that environment. Let's give him some company and let's be strategic about it. Community, let's mobilize.
And we should probably give him some company around that big table, shouldn't we?
Absolutely.
Okay, I'm not pointing any fingers at Danielle or anything. I'm just saying. Okay, so let me ask each of you as I go around the horn. What do you want the audience to take away from our discussion this evening, from our part two? What would you want audience members listening to part two to say? You know what? Here's the takeaway for me, giving the conversations of all of us, or well, all of you rather, and the minister. And I'll start with you, Chrystia.
For me, I think one of the key takeaways that I would love for, our viewers to really take away from is that to be, encouraged that there are leaders out there within organizations who are advocating on the behalf of the community to really push things forward. But more importantly, I hope that they learn some of the framework, especially that was shared with Emmanuel and Paulette, in terms of what that looks like in terms of when it comes to capacity building and how we can work together strategically to really move the agenda forward in terms of working collaboratively as organizations and as community as well. I think there were some great takeaways, and then also looking at where the funds were allocated in the budget in terms of addressing the Black community, whether it's through COVID, whether it's through the Black Entrepreneurship Fund. I think it's great to kind of look at those items and to identify what those gaps are, and how we can work together to really drive in those solutions.
Thank you, Chrystia. Daniela, what are you hoping, and what do you want the audience to, if there was a massive takeaway, what would you want that to be?
Right. One of my reflections is that, within every crisis lies great opportunity. So, how are we going to use this crisis and opportunity? How are we going to do things differently? When we look at the budget, let's not just look at the areas that specify, this money's been allocated to Black Canadians. How are we going to look at those other areas that the minister brought up, whether it's housing, procurement, those other areas, and make sure that we are using our voice and that we're speaking loudly and that we're getting a piece of those dollars that are there and that are available, because we should have access to those, and so we need to step forward and make sure that we get that money as well.
Thank you, Craig.
Yeah, I think it's less what they should take from us, but what we should take from them, and that's keep us accountable. One of the things we talk about is accountability and transparency. It is important that we, as leaders and organizations and the government as well, is kept accountable, and a huge part of that accountability is to the communities we serve. So to the audience, to the members of the community, keep getting involved. Let your voices be heard. Use organizations like us, use your political power to amplify your voice, and keep contributing with your questions and your comments, and keep us accountable. Let use us and level set us all the time.
Richard, what would you want the audience, and maybe it's not a single takeaway, but a really powerful takeaway for the audience after listening to this discussion?
I would say the fact that we have individuals in the community like Paulette, where we're able to, and Emmanuel, to work together and be able to have that information piece that you need to move forward. Craig brought up a good point that I've always expressed myself, the accountability. We have to be able, as a community, be able to hold these individuals or organizations out there accountable, and on a level where we want to know where this fund is being going, what it's been used for, but also have some metrics to back it up. So if someone comes to the table and says, what happened with this fund that we understand is 50 million or 100 million? Well, there's some kind of a metrics to go along to back up what the money was used for, because that's what's happening. We are hearing wonderful stories about this money at the end of the day, and the community knows that, but we still are not seeing the work and the money to do the work that it's set out to do.
Thank you, Richard. Paulette?
I didn't know about Keep Six until we started doing these sessions. So to me, there is so much brilliance and passion and commitment in our community. I am blown away. I've been doing this work for 3.5 decades. I'm coming to the end of my, time in terms of working at this, although I'll never stop working at this. So I am just blown away by the brilliance and beauty and I don't want to use the word overcapacity, but the opportunity that this brings to us around, like when else? I've never been a part of a meeting in the Black community to talk about a budget. Like that would be the most boring thing ever, right? But here it is. We have over 2,000 plus people who tuned into the last broadcast, and who knows where this one will go. Like this is something new for us, right? So this kind of engagement is amazing. So let's keep doing it, because that is the silver lining in the crisis that Daniela spoke about, is that because things are so concretized now around the pressures on our community, the fact that our people are dying, even though they're being sung as heroes, what they're being paid, what the attention that they're getting is not the treatment of heroes, right? And so it's about how do we step up for each other, both in terms of organizations that are doing this work like Keepsakes and others, but also in terms of individuals. And, you know, the stories I've been hearing during this pandemic have broken my heart time and time again, you know, time and time again. So how do we keep up the momentum and make sure that this means something at the end of the day, you know, and that we can actually rise from this to a community where we can hold our head high, right? Hold our heads high and be proud to be walking in our community. I mean, I was down at Little Jamaica today, and my heart broke because it's like a ghost town in terms of the businesses that were there, that were lively, that kept me alive, that I could stop in somewhere and go to Randy's or go to Raps or, you know, a Spence or whatever, right? And now I'm heartbroken. So now is the time with the Black Chamber of Commerce, with the right political leadership, with the right organizations. There's so much that we can actually do. So let's step up and let's use this opportunity as a way to build our community.
Well said, Paulette. I couldn't add not even a comment to that. I feel exactly the same way you do. And I think many people watching probably echo that same feeling. Thank you for that. Emmanuel?
My brother Mike, you're doing a disservice here to let me go after all these brilliant panel members, and especially my sister Paulette. I think the devil is in the implementation of the budget. I think the mechanisms to really mobilize the resources into the Black communities, that's where we need to work. So if there's one takeaway for me that I wanted the audience to think about, is remain engaged. Remain engaged, and I think some of the comments made around keeping us accountable, you know, Paulette's, you know, synthesis for me is like, this moment is unique. Mm-hmm. It's a double pandemic for our Black community. So there's no option but remaining engaged. Yeah. And then I think people like myself and others in this panel and out there in the community that are holding privilege and power, because we have access to the governments of the day, to policymakers, we owe to our community to deliver results. Yeah. And that's why keeping us accountable is important. So I'm looking forward to keeping pushing, working with Black community leaders to make sure that we're not lost in the devil of this implementation of this budget.
Thank you. Paulette, did you see the question that scrolled across the screen? You're on mute.
Not quite sure if that was in relation to my organization or what the government's talking about. So it's hard to answer that.
Okay.
Yeah.
I like where our conversations are going. I like where they began, and I like that the fact that we are educating. How do we continue to educate our community on areas such as capacity building, intermediaries, how to get access to how to get better access to government, or how to get better access to funding, or how to get better access to individuals like Emmanuel and Paulette, because it is obvious that that is a deficiency. People need that, as you see the comments coming across the board. How can we do that? What can we do going forward to give people a little bit more access to teaching or learning, or allowing them to learn more about access to capital, access to professionals like you, Paulette, or you, Emmanuel?
I think quickly, there are at the moment 7 actually learning labs that C Center for Black Young Professionals and NAPSI are rolling out. It's all about capacity building. It's around strategy, around granting, and so on. So please, we are going to share this information perhaps with Brother Richard to put out there. So there is stuff already that you can access. Around governance, if you want to build your governance and capacity, there is the Black Governance and Leadership Program that Taibu and its partners are already implementing. So, Michael, for me, a lot of this is about transparency. It's about access to information. What's out there? What's funded programs are there around capacity building? What, for example, the Black Intermediaries, they are preparing for the next call for proposals, yeah? So pretty soon, you will see information out there. So I think it's very important, as was mentioned earlier on, for Richard, I think, to really for the community to be having the capacity to access the information as it exists now. Who is being funded for what? You know, what's the level of dollars that is flowing in which area in the Black community, yeah? Black mental health. There has been a lot of funding around Black mental health federally. I'm not sure if people are aware who got the funding and what are they doing with the funding, yeah? So we owe it to the community to put almost like at a dashboard level about what's being funded, who is the implementing on this, who's been left out. I mean, like Paulette's reminders to the minister around LGBTQ issues, for example, yeah? Folks, it's time for us to have difficult but necessary conversations among ourselves. There are elephants in the room that we need to take out and slain, so to speak. Slain, not the right word, but openly talk about, yeah? So what I would offer from a NAPSI perspective, because capacity building is one of our mandates, is to be able to really be accessible. This year, we're going to launch 12 different transformational initiatives. We're going to launch, for example, a new initiative to deal with some of these issues of grassroots. We're going to create an entity that's going to support grassroots to easily access funds, for example, have wraparound capacity building supports. We're going to launch another initiative to bring, like, one thing that we're excited, for example, we're going to bring together Black scholars across the country and allies to launch a biannual report card on the state of Black communities. Where are we, you know, and what's the progress that we're doing? So I think there's a lot of stuff happening. The challenge that we have is there's differential access to that information at the moment. Some folks are accessing it, some folks aren't. We need to do better on that.
Paulette, I think you wanted to expand on that. And as you guys see the question from June Payne, if somebody wants to also tackle that, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, June is asking some good questions, but I wanted to build on what Emmanuel was just saying. A critical element for us in terms of the entire process I talked about earlier that I didn't mention is the piece around the funding piece is the first step. So when you fund an organization as an intermediary or as a funder, the next step is that's not the end of the relationship. It's then bringing people together, those who have been funded, to actually be able to create what Emmanuel's talking about, that kind of dashboard, right? So if we were able to say, okay, so we've been able to fund this group of organizations that works on mental health, or this group that works on gender-based violence, or this group that works in terms of economic development, right? If you bring those organizations been funded together, let them talk and share about the challenges and the successes and the areas that their hits and their misses, that kind of pieces, then you could actually then create ongoing improvement, development, if not transformation, right? So that's an important piece. So the funding is the first step, but bring the organizations together and take that responsibility of bringing them together, because that then develops further capacity within those organizations themselves in terms of the work they're doing. And that's one of the things that we've been doing by investing in it, right? So part of the funding we do is that we also always hire an evaluation piece to it. So we pay for that, bring folks together, and the evaluation happens at the same time that the funding has happened. So we're actually seeing in real time how the projects are going, and then you bring the organizations together to share best practices as well as how they can improve on what they're already doing. And then we also make sure that the funding is multi-year, right? You can't solve problem X in 1 year. So make sure that the funding is multi-year so you can actually dedicate some real resources, but also time to create the change that we want to see. So I just wanted to mention that as well.
Thank you, Paulette. Anybody wants to, is there an addition to June's question that anybody wants to tackle?
No, I don't.
I can.
Okay,
oh,
Paulette.
Yeah, sorry for my experience, Richard. I just want to say that one of the things that we do when we launch a call for proposals is that we hold, we bring people together for them to learn about it, right? So we talk about what it's about. We tell them what the priorities are. And if folks call in individually, we will work with them. So I want to preface what I'm saying, though. I'm the Canadian Women's Foundation. We're a mainstream organization. We're not a Black organization. I happen to be a Black woman leading a mainstream organization. So I just want to be clear about that. But even within the women's community, these same questions come up. And we must do the work from an intersectional lens. So that means that we must make sure that those who are most marginalized, most impacted, are the ones that we're prioritizing for funding. So that piece is also really important. But to answer June's question, is that provide the information, the criteria up front, bring people together, hold a meeting, tell people what it's about so they can actually have the best chance to get their projects funded.
Yeah, and if I can jump in as well, Mike. Yeah, and that's exactly. And a lot of organizations do that. I know, Paulette, your organization does that. The Ontario Trillium Fund has the exact same thing at the start of projects. In this, the funding, like with BBI and so on, they have that similar type of model as well, where you go out and you provide information sessions in terms of how to access grants, and that is something that is being rolled out with the government programs that are being done with those partners, and it is something that we are doing as well as we are about to roll out our community granting program. It is to build in information sessions regionally and so on as well about how to access our grants. What is the language to use? What are the things that we are looking for, and to ensure that we have an adjudication process that is transparent and open, and that when people do apply, that community organizations, funding organizations such as us, need to make sure that we're providing feedback into them so that they can build a better application process and make sure that they have a greater chance of success. And there's many Black community organizations that are doing that. And I think it is something that is very important. That when you do provide funding, as you said, you provide the supportive structure to make sure that people can be successful, and that you do your metrics to look at not just who got funded, but who didn't get funded. Where are the gaps? And how do you build on it for the next time to ensure that you address those gaps and the money is going to those who need it the most, not just those who have the shiniest applications and so on. It's about really drilling down and making sure that you are doing complete audits of that, and that infrastructure needs to happen from.
Danielle, you have Emmanuel. Danielle, you have a capacity building background with the Trillium Foundation and with LIFT. What do you have to say to all this? And then I'll go to Emmanuel.
Yeah, no, thank you. No, I certainly agree with both, Paulette and Craig. I think, it's really looking for those opportunities to, share best practices. Another piece too is just around that peer learning. So coming together and sharing, the experience and really discussing, what you're learning, because, having that support and, being open and transparent about the experience will help. And then, share that feedback so that, the sector, we can, make adjustments. But those two pieces are certainly very important when it comes to that capacity building, really focusing on pieces such as, measurement and being able to communicate your impact, and those areas that will help, in the long term with continuing to get funding and the support that's needed to continue the great work that's happening. So I think it's really about, working together and communicating and really, that peer aspect of connecting with each other.
Emmanuel, thank you. Thank you, Daniela.
And just to add, I think those are great points. The challenge for a lot of Black grassroots is actually, there was a comment that was almost like expressing the frustration in the grassroots layer that the funds don't make it to the grassroots, that they don't have the capacity to write the proposals, they don't have the structures that funders require to be there to be eligible for funding. I think the info sessions, walking them through the process is important. What we have to create for Black communities at the moment is, in lieu of those structures of financial management, governance, capacity to write proposals, the grassroots are great at doing the things, being close to the problem and supporting members of our community. We have to create for them structures that take care, so to speak, the headache, so to speak, that funders require. So that's where I think we need to look at innovation for introducing certain new practices that ensure that there is flow to the grassroots. And I think, Paulette earlier on, in terms of principles she mentioned, for example, we need to try new things. We need to do innovation. The way that we craft these grants, they don't need to be following the traditional granting practices. There is room actually to embed in our grant making process Afrocentric values, for example, of doing things that approximate our cultural value system and how we do business, in our community. We talk a lot about it takes a village to raise a child, And I've started talking about it takes a village to raise change for Black communities. So why can't we think about grant programs that invest in collaborations, enable innovation within the Black communities? Why can't we think of grant programs that interface between different segments of our Black community? The worst experience that I had over the years in the context of change in the Black community is seeing funding and money fragmenting our communities, creating more silos. Why don't you actually use grants and funds to build cohesion in our community, to bring folks to collaborate, bring faith leaders, bring private sector leaders, philanthropy, youth leaders, folks from our LGBTQ, newcomer communities. Let's use grants in an innovative way to actually build assets in the Black. We should not reduce this whole enterprise to transactional dollars. We need to find a way to actually build the capacity in our grassroots. There are a lot of, in Jane and Finch, we have such a richness of so many grassroots. And that's where we have a lot of challenge, for example, in terms of socioeconomic indicators. For the life of me, why can't we just bring innovation and bring all these grassroots and Black organizations and the city of Toronto and the federal government, the provincial government, private sector, for once and all, to create new structures for solutions and engagement, So I think the moment for us is to really recognize that, and Daniela, I think, used the word bold. It's time for bold leadership at the moment, and that's why I'm excited about working with all of you and others.
Thanks, Emmanuel. Paulette had written something terrific in the chat. Paulette, could you read where you start with the charitable organizations like yours?
Yeah, foundations like mine can only fund organizations that have charitable numbers. This has been particularly a tough problem for the Black community and other marginalized communities. I'm hearing a lot of feedback, so I apologize for that. But yeah, so it's a problem for us because a lot of organizations that spring up in our communities, in particular physical communities across the country, it's in response to some sort of oppression that folks have been experiencing, and then they can't access funds from foundations like mine. So I sit at a government advisory table called the Advisory Committee on the Charitable Sector. And so this is one of the things that we're working to address to see what we can do to address that. But maybe it's something for the Canadian Black Chamber of Commerce to take on, as it specifically deals with for-profit entities.
Chrystia, you've got 30 seconds.
Perfect. Absolutely. I mean, I think in terms of funding, what we've done as an organization is explored various partnerships. So through government, but also through private companies, in terms of establishing different programs, in terms of ensuring that those funds are available for small to medium-sized companies, whether you're at the startup inception phase or you're at the existing company phase where you might require additional resources to really expand and build your community in that capacity. And so we're continuing to kind of work closely with the government and the private sector to address that.
Thank you all. I think we're running out of time,
Yes.
if I'm correct. Listen, this has been an amazing discussion of passion and information. I love to see the people that are here on the screen. Thank you everyone for showing up. Thank you for watching. I hope that you were able to get great information from this, and also to know that you have individuals within the community who are indeed fighting for, whether it's grassroots or anybody else, are fighting for you and fighting for ourselves. So thank you so much for attending.